So we proceed now to your notes and loans receivable. So we said for notes receivable, this is evidenced by your promissory note, while your loans receivable is evidenced by a contract of loan. And we also said if ever the receivable comes from your PFRS 9, your initial measurement is your fair value plus transaction cost. So whenever we talk about fair value plus transaction cost, what is that fair value plus transaction cost in the form of your AR? We said generally that is your transaction price or your consideration. For NR, the fair value plus transaction cost is known as your present value of cash flows. For loans receivable, it is also your present value, which we will discuss later on how to compute. Let's proceed first for your NR. So for notes receivable, you need to determine whether it is interest bearing or non-interest bearing. You need to determine when it is interest bearing or non-interest bearing. For interest bearing, you need to determine whether it has a realistic rate. For realistic rate, when can we say it is realistic rate? There is no rule as to your realistic rate. But your US GAAP says that if the difference is 5%, then if the difference is at least 5% below, it is realistic. But if not, it is unrealistic. So if it is realistic rate, then you measure it at your face amount. If not realistic rate, you need to determine whether it is short-term or long-term. Why? Because for short-term, again, we said there is no discounting. For long-term, you need to compute it at the present value of cash flows using the market interest rate or the effective interest rate. How about for non-interest bearing? For non-interest bearing, you classify it as either short-term note or long-term note. For a short-term note, again, there is no discounting. Therefore, you measure it at face amount. For long-term note, you measure it at the present value of cash flows. So here, as you can see, mostly, you need to determine first or classify the note, if it's interest or non-interest. Once you can properly classify it, then you can now account for it based on whether you account it at face amount or at present value of cash flows. Dalawa lang naman siya. Face amount or present value of cash flows. Question: when will you use your present value of cash flows for notes? There are only two instances. What is the instance? Long-term, non-interest bearing. And then, next one, long-term, interest bearing, but unrealistic. So only during long-term notes nagkakaroon ng present value of cash flows. Long-term, non-interest bearing, wherein it is not realistic. Long-term, interest bearing, unrealistic, and long-term, non-interest bearing. So we keep on talking about cash flow. What is this cash flow? For cash flow, you need to determine the type of note. 'Di ba? Dalawang pagkomputan natin. Non-interest bearing and interest bearing. Non-interest bearing, that is long-term, and then interest bearing, that is long-term, but it is unrealistic. If it is non-interest bearing, the cash flow is only your principal. While for interest bearing, the cash flow is your principal and interest. Therefore, when we talk about present value, you compute only one present value here, the present value of principal for non-interest bearing long-term, and for interest-bearing long-term, which is unrealistic, you are computing two present values, present value of principal and present value of interest. So Take note, there are only two instances where we compute for the present value of cash flows. Non-interest bearing long-term, interest bearing long-term, but unrealistic. And what are the present value or cash flows that we compute? For non-interest bearing long-term, isa lang, present value of principal. Pag interest bearing long-term, which is unrealistic, present value of principal and present value of interest. Okay? Feeling ko, dito lang naman kayo nalilito eh. Kung kailan ninyo i-compute yung PV at kung saan yung PV na yon. Saan lang tayo magkaka-PV? Long-term non-interest bearing, long-term interest bearing, which is unrealistic. After that, what cash flows are we to compute? For non-interest bearing long-term, it is only the principal. Sir, bakit principal lang? Kasi nga, it is non-interest. In short, there will be no cash flow for interest. Kaya walang PV of interest dito. How about for interest-bearing long-term? It has both interest and the principal itself. That's why when you compute the present value of cash flows, you compute for both present value of principal and present value of interest. Now, since we are clear on when will we compute present value and what are the items of your cash flows, your next issue is what particular present value factor will you use? What present value factor will you use? So you need to determine now the cash flow. If the cash flow is lump sum or installment. Lump sum or installment. If it's lump sum, then you use present value of 1. If it's installment, you need to compare whether that installment is equal installment or unequal installment. Sir, anong difference ng equal at unequal? Let's say 500,000 per year. Ang tawag dyan ay equal. Ang tawag dyan ay equal. Pero paano pag ganito? 500,000, 1 million, 1.5, 800,000. Installment siya, tama? Pero unequal. Anong difference nila? In lump sum, there is only one-time payment. In installment, there are multiple payments. There are multiple payments. So if we're talking about multiple payments, you need to look as to that multiple payments, whether it is equal or unequal. If ever it is equal, then you need to determine the payment period. Is it made at the beginning of the period or is it made at the end of the period? If made at the beginning of the period, you use present value of ordinary, present value of annuity due. For end, present value of ordinary annuity. But if unequal, then you use PV of 1. If unequal, you use PV of 1. So what are, again, the most common problems that you encounter here? First, the determination of the type of note, whether it is interest-bearing or non-interest-bearing. Second, the computation of your present value of cash flows. We already said if that is interest-bearing long-term and it is unrealistic, you have both principal and you have interest. But if that is non-interest-bearing long-term, you only have your principal but no interest. After that, after you know the different cash flows, you must know what present value factor will you use. What present value factor will you use? And we said, if it is lump sum, PV of 1. If it is lump sum, PV of 1. If it is installment, unequal, PV of 1. If installment, equal, and made at the beginning of the period or end of the period, you will use present value of annuity due of 1. And finally, if in case what is given, if ever you don't know how to compute, if ever you don't know how to compute for the present value of ordinary annuity or annuity due of 1, that is known as the total of PV of 1. Total of PV of 1. In annuity due, n less 1, right? In ordinary annuity is n. So let's say you are given 5 PVs of 1. 5 PVs of 1. So let's say PV of 1, n is 1, n is 2, n is 3, n is 4, and n is 5. if you are using annuity due and the period is 5, ang gagawin nyo, 5 less 1, right? So yung total ng apat na yan yung annuity due. Sa ordinary annuity naman, kung ano yung N, yung total ng PV of 1 doon sa 5 period, yun yung ordinary annuity. And kung meron man kayong problema pa, kung paano kumuha ng ordinary annuity at PV of annuity due, 'di ba? Ito yung 5, yung total niyan mag-add ka ng 1. So what if you are given PV of OA? Let's say 5 and 4. Okay. PV of OA 5 and 4, and you need to get the PV of AD. The period is 5. So that is N less 1, so 5 less 1. So anong gagamitin yung PV factor? Ang gagamitin yung PV factor dyan ay kunin nyo yung OA na 4, mag-add kayo ng 1. Kasi yun na yung AD niya. Pansinin niyo yung total nga, mag-add ka ng 1, yun na yung AD. So in short, yung previous na OA, mag-add ka ng 1, yun naman yung AD niya. So yung OA ng 4, mag-add ka ng 1, yun yung AD niya. Actually, ang problema naman dito kasi sa current na setup natin, binibigay na yung ating mga present value factors, tama? So ang problema nyo, pagka yung present value factor na binigay ay hindi yung present value factor na alam ninyo. So saan ba kayo lilituhin doon? Yung binigay lahat yung PV of 1 pero ang kailangan naman ay ordinary annuity. Ay, alam mo na yan. Anong ibig sabihin nun? I-total mo lang lahat ng PV of 1 sa periods na yun na yung ordinary annuity. Paano naman kung given yung ordinary annuity ng different periods, ang kailangan mo pala annuity due? So kung ano yung period, i-deduct mo muna yung 1. Tapos, kunin mo yung ordinary annuity na yon, i-add mo 1, yun na yung iyong annuity due. So, kahit lituhin man kayo ng BOA sa pag-compute or sa mga binigay na given na present value factors, alam niyo or meron kayong workaround on how to compute for those present value factors. So, again, this is quite easy as long as you understood what you need to compute. So first, we started by discussing the different types of notes receivable and how do we measure it. Next, you need to determine whether that particular item, what are the different cash flows inside it. So let's say in non-interest-bearing long-term, it's only principal. In interest-bearing long-term, it is unrealistic. Okay? And after that, you need to determine the proper present value factors. And what did we say? If ever you are given PV of 1 for different periods, the total of PV of 1, that is your ordinary annuity. Okay? And then, if you want to convert your ordinary annuity to annuity due, just get first the ordinary annuity on the previous period. So let's say ordinary annuity of 5. Let's get the 4. And then you deduct on that 4 present value factor for that 4th period, you add 1 that is already your annuity due. Okay? So let's wrap up your notes. Okay, notes receivable for initial measurement. How do we initially measure your notes? It depends whether it is interest-bearing or non-interest-bearing. For interest-bearing, you need to determine whether it is realistic or not. If it is realistic, you measure it at face amount. And then, subsequently, you measure it at face amount. So, initial measurement, subsequent measurement. If it is not realistic, initial measurement is present value. And what are the items of present value? Principal and interest. Subsequent measurement is your amortized cost. Next, non-interest bearing. For non-interest bearing, you need to determine whether it is long-term or short-term. If long-term, you measure it at present value. Present value of what? Principal, no interest. Subsequent measurement, amortized cost. If short-term, face amount. Subsequent measurement, face amount. Your issue will only come from these two items. Your issue will only come from these two items. And How do you determine the present value factor? Again, you just need to determine whether it is lump sum or installment. For lump sum, PV of 1. For installment, you need to determine whether it is equal or unequal. If unequal, is still PV of 1. If equal, if made at the end, use PV of ordinary annuity. If made at the beginning, use PV of annuity due. So that is for initial measurement. Now let's go to your subsequent measurement. We have mentioned the subsequent measurement as amortized cost. In your amortized cost, we are using your effective interest method, EIM, effective interest method. And how does your effective interest method works? Under effective interest method, we have this formula. So the beginning carrying amount, you add any interest income, you deduct any interest received, you deduct any principal repayment, then that will be your carrying amount end. Carrying amount end. And normally, the effects of the following: interest income less interest received less principal repayment is known as your amortization. Amortization. Okay? Carrying amount end versus carrying amount. So beginning carrying amount less amortization is your carrying amount end. And lastly, as to your presentation. So how do we present it? So current if collectible within 1 year. Non-current if ever it is collectible for more than 1 year. But you have a problem here in your current and non-current as to those installment, as to those paid in installment. Okay. So what are your notes again? What are your notes? That is either interest bearing or non-interest bearing. For interest bearing, we have here realistic. Ano? Can we just divide the notes as with installment or it is lump sum? Installment or lump sum? For lump sum, it is considered current if due within 1 year. It is considered non-current if due for more than 1 year. So it's either lang. Sorry, bumaba yung either current or non-current. So isa lang yan. In installment, there is a current portion and non-current portion. The current portion is the amount collectible in the next period, while non-current portion is the remainder. And normally, if ever you are using present value, you have here amortization, right? And then carrying amount. So carrying amount, carrying amount, carrying amount. So this carrying amount is the ending carrying amount, right? But this ending carrying amount is divided as to these two items. So what are these two items? I'll use other colors so that you can see it. So the next ending carrying amount is known as the non-current portion, while the next year amortization is known as the current portion. Okay? If in case may PV lang, and kailangan ninyong i-divide siya as current as non-current, pag may PV, doon sa ating carrying amount and yung ating, let's say this is December 31 year 1, and then December 31 year 2. So this is the carrying amount on December 31 year 1, right? To divide that as current and non-current, the next carrying amount is non-current and the amortization is current, if ever it is installment. But if it's lump sum, if ever collectible within 1 year current, non-current if more than 1 year. So pag lump sum it's either. So either current or non-current siya. Pag installment, my current portion and my non-current portion. Dito ay end. You will divide it, current and non-current. In lump sum, either current and non-current. Third question, when will the installment notes receivable be only current or non-current? So installment notes will either be current or non-current only if ever it is already within its due date. Meaning, pagka pa-end na yung term ng ating notes. So let's say 5 years yung note natin, tapos ika-4th year niya na end. So therefore, at that 4th year end, i-classify mo na lang siya as current. Wala nang non-current kasi after that, tapos na yun. Tapos na yun. Okay? So, that is for your notes. That is for your notes.